So we're going to go ahead and get started. So the people who have your videos on, everybody should turn their video on because this is a workshop and it's going to be full participation. So right now I just want to see, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me and you can see the presentation. All right, so that's good. Give me a thumbs up. Thank you, Susan. Okay, so today's workshop is something that I've been developing seriously for the past 2 months, but something I've actually been developing for 10 years. And the name keeps on changing, and basically right now it's about solving China's unknown unknowns. And when I pause like that, I'm running this seminar by myself, so when people come in, I have to admit them manually. Okay, so all right, so quick little disclaimer, this is a public Meetup event, so I am recording these. And because so many people registered and not everybody's going to be able to attend, I always send the registered attendees a replay video so they can see what they missed, especially the guys and the people who've downloaded the workbook and they really want to go through the workshop with me today. All right. So one of the things, a lot of us have lots of experience doing business in Asia and doing business in China. I see a lot of people on the call who are also experts in doing business in China. And I think no matter how long you've been living or working in China or doing business in China, if you're not Chinese, there's always things you struggle with. And one of the things that I've discovered through my coaching and training is how important imagination is. So I like to start with this quote where John Lennon begins a very famous song, "Imagine there's no countries." And if we can imagine that there's no countries, I think we can all realize our China dream. And I'm going to talk about this because this is almost like a personal development training blueprint and program that's really going to help you improve your understanding of how Chinese people think and why they behave the way they behave and how best to develop relationships with them. All right, so the agenda today is very simple. We're going to keep it at 90 minutes. I'm going to do a quick introduction about how do you develop a winning mindset for doing business in China. We're going to go over the workbook and the worksheets. We're going to get into the workshop. I'm going to introduce the Solving China Unknown program, which is going to take about 2 or 3 minutes actually. And then we're going to do Q&A. And then everybody who's registered, I got all these cards, if you can still see me. Everybody who registered for the lucky draw, their names are here. If you're not on this list, then I can write your name in because you're on this call. All right. So again, this is going to be full participation once we get started. So I want to see how many of you have actually downloaded the worksheet, the workbooks, and did anybody print out the 2 worksheets for today's workshop? Okay, Susan, Alberto. Because so hopefully, everybody who registered this event will still get a download. So you'll still be able to go back and download. If you didn't download the worksheets or the workbooks, you can just have pen and paper ready because we really want to get you to think. Because if you don't really think deeply about some of the issues that you're having and some of the behaviors that you experience in China, you won't be able to develop new ways of interacting and create new patterns of communication and interaction. All right, so I always start with this. If anybody who's a fan of movies, this is Doctor Strange, and this is another master. His name is Mordo. And when I watched this movie for the first time, I think 5 years ago, whenever it came out, I was actually still living in China or living in Shanghai. And as I was watching this movie and the struggles that Dr. Stephen Strange, a brilliant neurosurgeon, was having to master the mystic arts, his intelligence and his myopia and his ego were always getting in the way of him achieving a breakthrough in mastering the mystic arts. And I remember there's a quote when Dr. Strange first was going to go into the inner sanctum. Mordo says, "Might I give you some advice? Forget everything you think you know." And for most foreigners doing business in China, no matter how long you've been there, it always is helpful if you start with a blank sheet of paper, because your previous experiences, your values, the things that you believe are right or wrong will cause you to judge Chinese people in a very negative way. And that will reflect in your attitude and your expressions, and ultimately it hurts your ability to develop the relationship and trust that you need and be able to get greater cooperation. So one of the things we focus on this program is really mindset. I used to do this presentation called A Mindset for China Business. I would lecture my former alma mater. I would go to different universities and I would talk about a mindset for China business. And what that really means is, until you have the right mindset, you won't have a healthy attitude in how you interact with Chinese people. And until you have the right attitude, you won't have the right approach. So your attitude, mindset, and approach, that combination is really what's going to help you change your reality doing business in China. I mean, you could be doing business in China for 10 years. You could be living and working there as an expat, and you will still be frustrated with things that happen with your local partners and your local employees. We're here to teach you how to change that. Okay, so I've kind of developed this infographic. It's called A Mindset for Creating New and Winning Communication Patterns. So basically, how do you transform the knowledge that you have, even if you speak Chinese, your language skills, your cultural understanding? How do you translate that into action that actually leads to a better result or a different result? Okay, so people go to China, foreigners, Westerners, Americans like me. When they go there for the first time, obviously it's a complete unknown. But after they've been there for a while, there are still things that continue to frustrate you. So what are the keys? And I think most people, especially consultants and trainers, they don't focus on the fundamental mindset shifts that you actually need. And it all begins with something that I call solving China's unknown unknowns. Okay, and it begins with two things that we all have. It begins with curiosity and imagination. So think about it this way. Having curiosity about something is actually the opposite of being judgmental. And I think without curiosity is the gateway to developing greater awareness, which is really important when you're doing business across cultures. And then the next is imagination. One of the things that we lose as we become adults and we become more experienced, we lose the ability to really use imagination. Why do people say the things they say? Why do people behave the way they behave? And I think imagination is what enhances empathy and the capacity to give other people the benefit of the doubt. Okay, that's so important if you're a Westerner doing business in China, is how do you give Chinese people the benefit of the doubt when you disagree or do not condone their actions and behaviors? And by having curiosity and imagination, this will help you develop greater awareness and empathy. A lot of people ask, how do you develop empathy? If you can't feel what other people feel, how do you develop that skill? Well, it starts with curiosity and imagination. With greater empathy, you start to understand how other people feel and why they feel the way they feel. And I think this is the key to unlocking possibilities or opportunities to connect on a deeper level, which is really important when you're doing business, especially in China. And greater awareness is not just cultural awareness, it's self-awareness. It's understanding how you as a foreigner are perceived by the people that you're talking to, because China is a very kind of indirect culture. So if you lack self-awareness, you may be speaking about something and you really have no idea what the Chinese people really think about who you are and what you're saying. And of course, situational awareness, that's really important. If you're in China, China has its rules, it has its policies. You really need to follow the rules because these are things that you cannot change. These are things that we call uncontrollable. And through that, greater awareness, greater empathy, this is how you begin to develop a new mindset and a healthier attitude, okay? And once you develop the right attitude, mindset, and approach, we believe, or I believe, you can create new patterns of communication and new patterns of interaction. So, people use this saying all the time, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and hoping to get a different result. This is the same thing that when you're doing business in China. If you don't change the way that you interact and the way that you communicate, you won't be able to create new patterns of communication and relationships and interaction, and ultimately develop a new approach, a new modus operandi, which kind of naturally allows you to focus on the things that will help you develop stronger Guanxi relationships. All right, so when we talk about China, we can all get into case studies and examples, but I think what's really helpful for anyone who wants to actually change their reality doing business in China is really get to the fundamentals. What is the number one challenge or the number one frustration for foreigners when they do business in China? To me, I think it's a reality where there's a lot of disconnect and dysfunction communicating with employees and communicating with partners, negotiating with government officials, working with partners, whatever it is. This is what we call reality A. And reality A can simply be described as circular conversations. Okay, these are the engagements and interactions that you have with Chinese people. So what we want to do is we want to study the habits and the peculiarities of how Chinese people communicate. And through this Solving China's Unknown Unknowns, I'm going to show you some tips, some tactics, and even give you some tools to be able to do two things. One is de-escalate negative dialogue that you may have with Chinese people. And number two, make your assertions more acceptable. And the reason you have circular conversations is Chinese people simply don't accept what you're saying. And that's the thing that we want to try to change. And the goal is to create a new reality, one in which you have winning cooperation. You have better results and better outcomes. And in this program, we will help you translate, because so many of you have so much experience in China already. You have the knowledge, you have the insight. But how do you translate that knowledge and insight into a healthier attitude, mindset, and approach that will allow you to create a sustainable long-term cooperation with both your Chinese partners and your Chinese employees? Now, we do that by first, and this is what we're going to go over in the workshop today, we're going to go over some cultural dichotomies. We're going to figure out how do we activate our imagination to be able to empathize with the cultural differences and do something that I call master the rules of playing and winning the Chinese game inside the China arena. Okay, so if you're in China and you're dealing with mainly people who are Chinese, then you should learn the rules of the game and how to play. And then from circular conversations, understanding the dynamics of how that works, we're going to get into negotiations. This is about relationships and deal making. So we're going to study Chinese tendencies that resemble art of war tactics. Okay, so one of the things that I've noticed is Chinese people, most of them have never studied the art of war, but it's so embedded in their culture. A lot of their behavior and tactics resemble art of war tactics. They just do it naturally. So what we want to do as foreigners who don't understand the art of war and don't understand Chinese culture, we want to learn how to counter these tactics in order to gain an advantage during negotiations, but not only during negotiations, but also throughout your partnership and throughout your cooperation. All right, so this is where, if you downloaded the workbook, we're going to actually get into some of the modules or some of the lessons, and we're going to get everybody to answer these questions and see what you come up with. All right, so if you haven't downloaded the workbook, just get a pen and paper because I'm going to show everything on the screen. If you download the workbook, there's two workbooks. There's one for this workshop that's about 18 pages, and then there's also 80 pages, which is the full course and all of the lessons. So you get all that for free just for registering. If you want to do this kind of like a self-guided thing, that's all the information is there. All right. So is everybody ready? Can you give me a thumbs up? All right, so we're ready. Okay, so the first module is about cultural dichotomies. And we're skipping directly to lesson 2, part 1, and this is truth. The definition of truth. What we think is true and what we think is false is actually a cultural dichotomy. When I say we, I'm talking about we as Americans or we as Westerners. Okay? So in the cultural dichotomy of truth, Westerners tend to think in absolute truths. That means we talk about facts and literal meanings, and we speak in a very direct manner. Chinese tend to believe and think in relative truths, and they communicate in a figurative, face-saving style, and it's very indirect. All right? So when Westerners communicate with Chinese, a lot of times the conversations feel circular because we don't agree on what's true and what's not true. And what usually happens is when we as Americans or Westerners, when we go to China, we ask questions and we share an opinion. What we're really doing is we're making an assertion. Okay, this is my opinion. When I ask a question, sometimes it's rhetorical. It basically reflects what my values are and what I believe. And the thing that we really have to understand is that most Chinese people will subconsciously dismiss and emotionally reject most attempts by foreigners to make and justify their assertions. And the reason they do this is they oftentimes, especially if you're in a position of authority, they believe you're implying something negative about them. Okay? And they also believe that you lack the proper historical and cultural perspective from the Chinese point of view. And they probably feel that they have been misunderstood. Okay, so as soon as you ask a question or as soon as you make an assertion, they will start to dismiss and emotionally reject what you say. This is just something that kind of happens. And this is the reason why your attitude is so important. And we'll get into attitude mindset adjustments as we go through this program, but this is the reason why your attitude is so important. You can say all the right things and understand all the nuances of Chinese culture, but if you don't have a right attitude, people can feel that and it will be reflected in their ability to accept what you are saying. All right, so one of the mindsets and the attitude that we should develop if we want to develop, again, the core foundation is closer Guanxi relationships. We shouldn't expect Chinese to be willing or able to articulate what they're thinking across language and cultural barriers. Okay. A lot of us as foreigners, we go to China, we've been there for a while, we feel we know our Chinese partners and employees, we feel we know them very well, we speak to them every day, and we naturally expect that they are able and willing to articulate something that they don't even feel we have the capacity to understand. So that's an attitude that we slowly want to change. Because it is natural, and I'm sure a lot of you doing business in China have experienced this a lot. It's natural when we make an assertion, ask a rhetorical question, or ask a direct question. It's natural for Chinese to offer explanations that sound like excuses and justifications that feel like overarching rationalizations. And this is just the Chinese figurative manner of speaking. And the attitude that we really need to be aware of, and this is both conscious and subconscious, is that we don't judge the Chinese people for behaving naturally. And again, this is, a training program, a development program, but if you just kind of want tips and strategies and tactics on how to reduce circular conversations, well, you have to kind of refrain from reiterating what you consider are valid points, even if you feel it reinforces your position. Because when you're doing business in China, it's not about right or wrong. It's about what moves the relationship and the business forward. So we really need to not focus on the details of right or wrong. You also want to condition yourself to accept what I call implausible explanations. A lot of times when I'm communicating with Chinese people, sometimes when I'm communicating with my Chinese wife, they'll say things that I think are ridiculous. Okay. And the thing that we have to understand is when they answer you, when they say something and it's an explanation, they're actually not really trying to answer your question because they don't really even believe your question is valid. They're just trying to appease you with an explanation. There's a difference. When Normally when we ask a question, we expect direct question, get a direct answer. But in China, they just want to appease you. So you have to condition your mindset that this is what's going on in the conversation in order for you to move forward. So you want to internalize that your logical means of persuasion, when you try to persuade people in China, will unlikely influence real acceptance. You'll get a lot of head nodding and a lot of agreement, but rarely will you get real acceptance because you are likely as a foreigner perceived as ignorant and lacking a proper perspective. And if you really talk deeply with Chinese people in Chinese, that's what they'll tell you. All right. So to reduce circular conversations, the goal is simply to get to the next topic as seamlessly as possible. It is okay to leave things ambiguous. In fact, this is Chinese history. I've been reading On China by Kissinger about his initial meetings with Mao on the opening up of China. And they always talk about, Mao would talk about different things and it would just be ambiguous. It would be deliberately ambiguous. And the way to move forward in the relationship is just to get to the next topic and not worry about tying things down or locking things down. And that's really, really hard for most Westerners to do. All right. Now, the second half, again, we're going to get into the worksheet soon. We're already into the workshop, but I'm going to go through this, and then we'll get into the worksheets that you downloaded. All right. So, in relationship to truth is also something called truth default. Okay, and I think this is really important. This is, of course, again about self-awareness. All right. So, so there's a book that Timothy Levine wrote called Duped, and it's about truth default theory. It's about the social science of lying and deception. So basically, truth default theory is based on the assumption that when we communicate with others, and when we say we, again, we're talking about Westerners. When we communicate with others, we tend not only to believe them, but it rarely enters our mind that maybe we shouldn't. Okay, this is the truth default theory. And why is this good? So this is good in most Western societies because truth default is needed for communications to function because most people are mostly honest most of the time. All right? And of course, the negative side of truth default theory is it makes people vulnerable to deception. And the book talks about this. But there are triggers that can help us break out of our truth to honest mindset to enable lie detection. Okay? Again, this is written from a very Western point of view. Now, the countercultural perspective is that Chinese people aren't vulnerable to deception in the same manner as we Westerners are. And the reason is because Chinese only trust those they've developed Guanxi relationships with. Okay, so truth default theory actually works different with the Western mind as it does with a Chinese mind. So if we look at truth default as a dichotomy, as a cultural dichotomy, this is what I believe. Okay, Westerners tend to default to truth with strangers, but especially recently, they will mistrust specific groups of foreigners based on media bias, media coverage, and sometimes if they've had a prior negative experience, like if you've been doing business in China for a long time, if you've had some negative experiences, you may not default to truth like you would with somebody who looks like you and comes from the same place as you. And these, again, are cultural biases. Now, Chinese people, on the other hand, they tend to default to skepticism towards everyone, which is why only developing Guanxi relationships will change their level of trust. And this is cultural. All right? So, truth default awareness, this is part of self-awareness, is really, really important. And we're getting ready to go into the worksheet. And the question that you really have to examine about yourself, in my opinion, if you want to go through this type of program, is how is your default trust level towards strangers, people that you're meeting for the very first time, affected? if you're the same nationality, if you're the same ethnicity, if you're the same ethnicity and nationality. For example, for me, I was born and raised in America. If I meet another ABC, American-born Chinese, does that change my level of default trust if I don't know this person? And then the next question is, how about gender? Do you have gender biases towards people of the opposite sex? Does it increase your level of trust if you learn that this person graduated from the same university that you did? How about if they were born and raised in the same city or the same region as you? How does that change your default trust level? Okay, so in the program, for every worksheet, you would post it into the Facebook group with the hashtag. So in this case, it would be hashtag truth, and you have this worksheet. Okay, so I know that some of you probably didn't print out this worksheet, but if you got a pen and paper, we're going to get into the full participation now. I'm going to go through the worksheet real quick, and then I'm going to unmute everybody, and we're going to see what you think about this concept of truth and truth default, and how do you think this may affect your perceptions and attitudes towards people in China, especially people you're meeting for the very first time. All right. So the first question is, again, what we just went through. What is your default trust level towards strangers? You want to try to go through these exercises and really become more self-aware. Yeah, when I meet somebody from my same school and university, I trust them more. Now, Chinese people that I've never met before, I trust them less. Why? Different nationality, different ethnicity. They didn't go to the same school. They didn't come from the same birthplace. So this is one of the things that you want to think about. How does it affect your biases? All right. The second is, what is your truth default towards strangers? So which one do you gravitate to? So I trust most everyone. I trust strangers only if one of those things. Or I default towards skepticism. That means I'm skeptical of everybody. Okay, most Chinese people check that third box. They're skeptical of everyone. Now, they don't behave that way. Now, Chinese people behave like they're friends with everyone when they first meet. They're so hospitable. We call that the honeymoon period. Don't get distracted by that. Deep in their minds, they are skeptical. Not just towards you as a foreigner, but towards everyone. Chinese people don't trust each other. And that's just innate in their culture. Or default towards skepticism towards foreigners who are. Again, this relates to that very first question. All right. The third one is, what tactics might enable you to align with someone who communicates in relative truth? Okay, so if you're seeking answers, you want the facts, you want to know what's going on, you want to sell something, you're negotiating, and you just want to put all your cards on the table, but you're actually communicating with somebody who communicates, thinks, and believes in relative truths. Okay, so this is like you have children and their siblings, and one of them will always believe what's fair is relative to what the other one gets. That's a relative way of thinking. If it works for one person, or it worked for this person that they observed in the past, then they should get the same deal. This is how Chinese people think. For them, it's all relative to what they've perceived about the past or something that's happened before. And there could be a wide chasm between what's factually true in one situation versus another situation. So we want to think about, well, what do we do if we're talking in absolute truths, but the other person can only think in relative truths? All right. All right. So this is the entire program. So module 1 is cultural dichotomies, circular conversations, Chinese negotiations, winning cooperation. And these are kind of the main cultural dichotomies that we highlight in order to really trigger our imagination and curiosity. Okay, so I'm going to stop the share screen now before I continue with the next So the next, I'm going into module 2. We're going to talk a little bit about circular conversations. But before we get into that, I really want to hear some of your opinions about truth and truth default. All right, so I am stopping the share screen. All right, so I want to do this really quickly. This is about circular conversation. So we've had the nice discussion. We're going to have more after this short segment. But one of the things, we all develop these experiences doing business in China, and we all think this is just the way it is. And it's about these circular conversations. So lesson 2 of module 2 is called When We Ask Why. All right. So whenever we want to begin a conversation, a great lead-in question is always to ask why. All right. Sometimes we ask why out of curiosity, but sometimes we ask why because we need answers. We're managing something. We're trying to make a decision, and we need to ask why. And this goes back into the direct communication and indirect communication, and why asking why may not give you the answers that you seek. Okay, so why asking why may not work in China. So if you are in a position of authority, and even if you're negotiating, you're working with a partner and something has gone wrong, whenever you ask why did this happen? Can you explain this? Well, Chinese people interpret that literally, which means they think you need a reason or an explanation to be satisfied. And what they usually do is they oblige. But they oblige not by giving you what we talked about in the previous lesson, which is the truth. They oblige by telling you what they think you want to hear. Okay, so one of the things that they're always trying to do, and they do this subconsciously, I think, is they want to try to divert attention away, because China is, again, a very collectivist society. So they want to try to divert attention away, and they don't want to have any type of blame. All right, so getting into truths and facts, which we talked about before, Chinese struggle with telling you facts and literal truths because they think in relative terms. And it's antithetic in a collectivist culture for people to assume ownership or personal responsibility. Now, this could be a contradiction with some of the things that you perceive when you're interacting with them, but we're talking about not what people say on the surface, but what people believe and how they think. All right, so one of the things that we want to do is we want to have self-awareness of our own perceptions. Okay, so let's go back to this real quick. So if we're asking a question, we need an explanation, and Chinese people are trying to divert attention, and they're trying to just tell you what they think you want to hear, but they won't give you the truth because they don't think in those terms. Let's talk about how we perceive that. Okay, so one of the ways we perceive that is, well, we're skeptical, and we doubt what they're saying is actually true. All right, so what happens when that happens? Well, this is likely going to trigger a circular conversation. Okay, our skepticism and our doubt. Another thing that may happen is we get all the answers we want. They tell us what they think we want to hear, and we hear what we want to hear, and we're delighted and we're satisfied. And what likely happens is this will lead to an eventual disappointment. Okay, so between these two extremes, what other alternatives do we have? Well, the other thing is, if you go through this program, which I call Solving China's Unknowns, I think you will be expected and prepared. Okay, and this will enable you to get the real answers while being able to give face to the people that you're asking questions to. You'll be able to maintain your Guanxi relationships, and ultimately, which is the most important thing, you'll be able to discover solutions to the problems that you have. Business is, no matter what country you're in, it's all about solving problems, and you can't solve problems if you can't get the answers. And if you can't get answers in China by asking why, then you have to figure out an alternative way to get the answers you want. So I want everybody to be aware to not let your ego or your biases take over your emotions and your decision making, especially as in so many of our examples. We've been doing business in China for so long, we think we know exactly how things work and how people behave, and we don't think they're ever going to change. Well, the goal is not for them to change. The goal is for us to make adjustments on how we behave, which will influence their behavior. So we always want to seek an alternative, kind of face-saving, indirect way to get the answers that we seek. So the next worksheet, when we ask why, this is module 2, lesson 2, is you want to list the pros and cons. So this is kind of almost like a role-playing exercise. List the pros and cons of directly confronting an employee suspected of stealing. Okay, so you have to understand what are the pros, what are the cons if you confront them directly. Then the question number 2 is, how could you engage with other team members to get the truth? So maybe you don't have to go directly to the person you suspect of stealing. Maybe there's an indirect way to get the answer to the truth. How could you leverage external stakeholders, like your suppliers or your customers, to also get the answer that you're seeking? Is this employee stealing from me? And number 2, who else could you empower to discover the truth and how you should proceed? Okay, so we're gonna maybe we'll get into this. I'm gonna just finish this real quick before we get into the discussion. So this is the entire program: dichotomies, circular conversations, Chinese negotiations, winning cooperation. We went through 2 lessons in today's workshop: the truth default, and why we ask why. This entire program is basically, it's lifetime access. There's 4 modules, there's 22 lessons, there's 20 worksheets, there's videos, and there's case studies. Most of you have already downloaded the 80-page workbook, but there's also a mastermind community where all of the other China experts will be there, and you post your answers and we have discussions. And so this is the first time I'm launching this program, and I'm going to do weekly Zoom Q&A calls for an entire year. And so the full program will eventually be $2,000. If you just want the course only, that's just lifetime access to all the content and lifetime access to the Facebook community. It's $197. All of you should be getting this coupon in your email for 30% off. And one of the things is, because this is the first time I'm launching this, I'm not even going to offer the full program. It's just basically, I'll call it an early adopter special. It's basically, if you enroll in the program, you're going to get everything for the entire year. And you're also China experts. So you're going to be helping me develop and refine this program over time. All right? So everybody's going to be getting something in their email box. We're going to get into the Q&A, and then at the end, we're going to do a lucky draw. So these are the lucky draw prizes. I'm going to go through these real quick before we get into them. We'll do the lucky draw at the end before the 90 minutes is up. We have another 30 minutes, so that'll give us plenty of time to talk. So I'm going to give away 1 physical workbook. Okay, so I'll be shipping this to somebody today. I've got all the cards of the names of people who register for the lucky draw. I'm writing another hardcover book. This is not this, but there's a hardcover book that's going to be published this fall. It's called Solving China's Unknown Unknowns. I'm going to give away an ebook copy, and I'm also going to be giving away a signed hard copy. And this, again, it'll be fall of this year. I'm also going to be doing an interview podcast with a guest and offering a 1 private one-on-one Zoom call. So this is kind of like if you hired me as an advisor or a trainer, we'll speak privately on Zoom for whatever you want. Hopefully you have a challenge that you're struggling with in China, and I can help you brainstorm and come up with ideas to solve those issues. All right? So this is the end of the formal presentation